I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Cory Doctorow, a well-known science fiction author, activist, journalist, and blogger, currently engaged in writing at both pluralistic.net and craphound.com. Among his many accomplishments, Cory is the author of numerous fiction and nonfiction novels, former co-editor of Boing Boing, former European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an MIT Media Lab research affiliate, visiting professor of comp sci at the Open University, visiting professor of practice at the University of North Carolina School of Library and Information Science, and co-founder of the UK Open Rights Group. Cory's the winner of numerous awards and honors, including the John W. Campbell, Locus, Sunburst, White Pine, Prometheus, and Inkpot awards for his writing, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award. In 2020, he was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. In 2022, he earned the Sir Arthur C. Clarke Imagination and Service to Society Award for Lifetime Achievement. Additionally, York University made him an Honorary Doctor of Laws, and the Open University made him an Honorary Doctor of Computer Science. So, Cory, welcome, sir. You've had a tremendous career writing fiction and social commentary on our changing world, but you may be best known for the American Dialect Society's 2023 Word of the Year, Enshittification, which is described as a pattern of decreasing quality of online platforms that act as two-sided markets. So this alone speaks to the tragic nature of internet culture, in addition to the word itself, which describes internet platform decay. So what are your thoughts on this situation, I guess?
Well, I mean, enshittification is a funny word that's fun to say, but I've been talking about this and giving it all kinds of weird names for many years. This is the one that's stuck. I'm delighted that it has. And the analysis is a lot deeper than just a funny word with a swear word in the middle of it. If we think about platform decay as being a disease, the analysis starts with explaining what the symptoms of the disease are, what it's like to be using a platform that enshittifies, and then what the underlying mechanism is like what's going on under the hood that allows for enshittification. And then finally, like what the epidemiology of it is. Like, how is it that we are in this plague of enshittification where everything is enshittifying all at once? So I don't know if you'd like me to go through all three of those stages, just one of those stages. I mean, I can monologue on this for a very long time, so you tell me.
You know, it is totally up to you. I just want to put out there that I love the fact that you are addressing this, because you are going to issues that are so, I mean, these are mega trends in internet culture. You're one of the few people who has been online, writing, blogging, and being a public persona to be able to make these statements, you know, with some authority. And so I love the fact that you're tackling this head on, because this is something that we all struggle and suffer with, right, over time. And yet nobody talks about it. We just kind of accept it as it is. So yeah, I would say go for it.
Well, thank you. Sure. So let's talk first about the what if this were a disease, we'd call its natural history. Like, what are the symptoms of enshittification? Enshittification proceeds in three stages. So in stage one, you have a company that has some surplus, right? They've got their investors' capital, and they're good to their users. They bring users in. So let's use Facebook here. Facebook had a bunch of money. You know, it started as a project to allow Mark Zuckerberg and his creepy friends to non-consensually rate the fuckability of Harvard undergraduates. It got worse after that, incredibly, but at a certain point, Peter Thiel and a bunch of other people gave him money to play with. So he's got this money, and he starts offering it to his users in the form of a high-quality service. So a lot of people don't remember this, but in 2006, Facebook went from a service that could only be used by college kids who needed a .edu address to being a public service, something that anyone could sign up for. And of course, we already had a widely used piece of social media back then. It was called MySpace. And everyone who wanted social media had a MySpace account. And so he needed a pitch for MySpace users. He needed a way to bring them in. So his pitch to them was, I know all your friends are on MySpace and you like it there, but has it ever occurred to you that MySpace is owned by an evil, crapulent, senescent Australian billionaire named Rupert Murdoch, and he's spying on you with every hour that God sends? Come to Facebook. Facebook is the no spying version of MySpace, where we won't ever surveil you. All we're going to ask you to do is lay out the people who matter to you in this world. And then whenever they post something, we'll put it in your feed, right? If they have something they want the people who follow them to see, you'll see it. That's our pitch. So users pile into Facebook and they get locked in. This is key to enshittification. There has to be lock-in. Different platforms have different ways of doing it. Amazon locks up all their audiobooks with digital rights management. Uber bankrupted every taxi service, and Apple uses proprietary app stores so that you can't easily migrate from one mobile platform to another. But with social media, there's actually a much easier form of lock-in. The users do it themselves, and that's because there's this thing called the collective action problem that economists talk about, which is the idea that it's really hard to have a bunch of people, even people who like each other and want the same thing, to agree on how to get that thing. We've all seen this where like you and your friends in the group chat are trying to figure out what movie you're going to watch this Friday, and you can't agree on it. Imagine if that's a couple hundred friends and you're on Facebook, and some of you have your customers there. Some of you, it's like where your kids' Little League team organizes the carpool, and some of you are there because you've got a rare disease and that's where everyone else with that disease is discussing it, or because you're an immigrant and everyone in your home country is using this to communicate with you. It can be really hard to unstick yourself from Facebook, even if you don't like it. Facebook knows this. So they start to take away that surplus that they gave to users, the kind of honest interface where we don't spy on you and we show you what you want. And they start to take some of that value away and give it to business customers, because Facebook's a platform. And enshittification is a disease of platforms. Platforms are two-sided markets, businesses that serve commercial customers on one side. With Uber, that would be the drivers, and end users on the other, the riders. With Amazon, it's buyers and sellers. You get the idea. So Facebook wants to bring in a couple of different kinds of business user. The first kind is advertisers. And they say to the advertisers, hey, do you remember when we told these suckers that we weren't going to spy on them? That was a total lie. We spy on them from asshole to appetite. All you need to do is specify some criteria and give us a remarkably small amount of money, and we are going to target exactly the people that you said that you want to see with the message that you crafted. And we've got a whole building full of engineers who do nothing but fight ad fraud. So if you give us $1 to show an ad to a specific user, that's the kind of user that's going to see it, and they'll definitely see it. And they went to the publishers and they said, hey, do you remember when we told these hayseeds we were only going to show them the things that they asked to see? That was also a lie. If you were to give us just like excerpts of your content and a link, we're just going to like non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of users. Some of them will just click, right? Some of them will subscribe. You'll get this free traffic funnel that will turn into a long-term source of traffic to your website as people subscribe to your feed. And then those publishers and those advertisers get locked into the platform, becomes critical to their businesses because that's where the users are. And then Facebook starts to alter the deal, right? They say to the publishers, hey, you're going to have to put a little more of an excerpt in, and they turn the dial so that the likelihood of your content being seen by someone, even someone who subscribes to you, goes way down unless you're putting a lot of the article, most of the article, finally all of the article, and then all of the article and no link back to your own website because it might be a, quote, malicious link. And so Facebook wants to make sure that they're not sending users to a bad site. So you can't have any way to monetize those users except Facebook. And here's the bad news. Facebook's also screwing the advertisers. So the cost of an advertisement goes up. The fidelity of the targeting goes down. The amount of ad fraud goes through the roof. So, Procter & Gamble killed a $100 million per year programmatic advertising spend in, I believe, 2018, and they saw a $0 drop in sales because basically those ads were either not being seen by anyone or being seen by just randos that were completely unrelated to their targeting criteria. So you have advertisers where things are getting worse, you have publishers where things are getting worse, and you have users where things are getting worse because the amount of stuff in their feed that they ask to see is being dialed down to this like homeopathic residue, which leaves a void that can be filled by stuff that people pay to boost, because the publishers are now having to pay to boost to reach the people who ask to subscribe to them, not just the people who don't know about them, and the advertisers having to pay more too. And so this is the final stage of enshittification. This is the terminal phase, because Facebook's goal here is to find this equilibrium where they're leaving enough residual value in the system that users don't become unstuck from it, so business customers don't become unstuck from it. But they don't want to leave any more, right? If there's a penny available for their shareholders, they want to claw it back. And that equilibrium is so brittle, right? One whistleblower, one live stream mass shooting, one privacy scandal, and people go from, I hate this place, but I have to keep using it, I don't know why, to like, I'm leaving. And when that happens, the platforms undergo this process that you and I would call panicking, but they flatter themselves by calling pivoting. And Facebook's pivot in this case was like, I know that we spent 15 years trying to convince you that the future of telecommunications was arguing with your racist uncle in a primitive chat forum, but actually we've got a much more advanced vision for the future. We're going to convert you into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character in a virtual world called the metaverse that we stole from a 25-year-old cyberpunk novel. And that's the final stage of enshittification. That's when it all turns into a pile of shit. And if the platform doesn't die, it's on life support at that point. It's probably terminal. And so that's what, if you were a doctor, you call the natural history of the disease. But as I mentioned, and we can talk about this separately, there's like how this works, like what the platform's doing on the back end to make this happen, and also why it's happening now, why everything is turning into a pile of shit all at once. Because, knowing how the trick works doesn't tell you why the trick is being accomplished right now, why the nature of the internet is changing in this moment.
Well, let's come back to why that's happening right now. I want to try and summarize this. I'm going to actually use your own words that are published online. You'd written, here's how platforms die. First, they're good to their users. Then they abuse their users to make things better for business customers. Finally, they abuse those business customers to claw back the value for themselves. Then they die. So again, this process of platform decay, which we're calling enshittification, has been used by various people to describe Amazon, Bandcamp, Facebook, Google Search, Reddit, Twitter, and Unity. And when I read that list, my first thought was, my God, this list isn't nearly large enough. I mean,
probably for sure. Twitch, and yeah, we could just go on all day. Uber, Airbnb. I mean, if it's a platform, it's dynamic.
Yeah. So, we're using Facebook they are a fun case study, but this is something that is endemic to all of these major platforms. And one of the things that I've wondered is maybe this is kind of a part of a natural life cycle for these platforms as well.
So this is where I actually slightly disagree, and I think it's a common mistake that people make when they're thinking about this stuff. So I think that people think that this is inevitable, or that it's the result of specific bad people taking over the companies, right? Clearly, like that is the case sometimes. The change in management in Twitter had a marked impact on Twitter's, overall reliability and the quality of using it for most of its users and so on. But I think that when it happens all at once to a lot of different platforms that have different management, it militates for an explanation that makes reference to some external factor, right? If it were the natural endpoint of platforms, then, if a platform ran for a certain number of years and then turned into a pile of shit, you would expect that the Gen Xers in our platforms, which are like Microsoft and Apple, which were founded in the 70s, would have enshittified 25 years ago, and that elder millennials like Google would be enshittifying right now, and that Facebook, the Gen Zer in the pack would have another 10 years. But that's not how it's working out. They're all reaching this end stage all at once. So it's not like senescence. It's instead, I think, some external set of factors that changed. And so this raises the question, what could those external factors be? A lot of people will reach to the end of the zero interest rate policy, ZIRP, where federal banks around the world were effectively giving money for free to large firms. And so they could give you a big surplus because they had a big surplus. The money didn't cost them anything. And when the ZIRP ends, the investors say, all right, time, party's over, time to start making money. But the thing is, the timelines don't line up. Like if you think about when Facebook enshittified, it was a long time before the end of ZERP, right? Same with Amazon, right? Some people will say like it's the change in management. A lot of the mature large tech firms went from being run by their founders to being run by people who were promoted from inside. So, this is Tim Cook and the top men at Microsoft and Google, or the various platforms have all kind of gone in this direction. And so maybe, it's tempting to say, oh, well, the first guy was a visionary who had his users' interests at heart, but that, bloodless businessman who replaced him is just, a sociopath who'd sell his mother for a nickel, and that's why it's all going downhill. But I don't think that's the case either. I mean, Google got much shittier when the founders came back during their AI panic, right? Like the market enshittification of Google coincides with the return of the founders, not with their departure. So this raises this question, like, what is the external force, right? Is it like Mercury in retrograde? And it can't be that, because I'm a Cancer and Cancers don't believe in astrology. So I think that it's the removal of 4 constraints that have historically operated on tech, that were eroded over decades, and that all gave way more or less at once. And the first and most important constraint was competition. And historically, companies that worried about losing your business treated you better. And if they didn't, you could go somewhere else and they'd go out of business. And 40 years ago, we started weakening antitrust law in the Carter administration. He pulled out a couple of Jenga blocks, and then Reagan pulled out several fistfuls. And then every administration since has been removing Jenga blocks from the antitrust tower, and the tower has just fallen over. And so we allow companies to grow through conduct that would have just been unlawful prior to the Carter administration, or even more recently than that. They buy nascent and major competitors, whether that's the Microsoft Activision merger, just plainly anti-competitive and should not be allowed, or the, conduct of companies like Google, where you have a company that had one really good product, right? They made the world's greatest search engine a quarter of a century ago, got a ton of access to the capital markets, and then just bought everyone else's good ideas while failing completely to make their own stuff work, right? I mean, almost every product they've launched in-house has been a failure. Meanwhile, their whole ad tech stack, their mobile stack, server management, docs, collaboration, maps, satellite photos, everything is someone else's idea that they operationalized. And I'm an ops guy. I was a systems administrator. I'm not going to say that that's not anything, but that's not innovation, right? That's just sustenance, which is fine. Sustenance is important. We need to keep things running, but it's not coming up with new things, and it's not disruption, right? It's not, well, there's 2 ways to search the web. One is that Yahoo pays people to decide all the good websites and puts them in a directory. The other is that AltaVista writes a keyword counting program that counts how many times the word cat appears on your page. And if it's the most, that's the top result for cat. And then Google comes along and goes, wait a second, we've got a third way. We're going to count all the backlinks to websites, and we're going to rank them that way. And all of a sudden, the entire web snaps into order in a way that had never been seen. We don't get that anymore, because if anyone threatens Google in that way, they just get to buy them out. They get to do things like pay for default, where they're spending $25 billion a year, where on just making sure you never try another search engine, right? So it's like every service, every browser, everything you could conceivably use, it comes with Google as the default and sometimes the only available search tool, which means that no one starts another search engine. That was illegal. You have things like predatory pricing, where like Uber lost 41 cents on every dollar to the tune of about $32 billion over 13 years. Most of that was Saudi royal money funneled through SoftBank. And they just put all the taxi companies out of business and convinced all the transit companies to stop investing in transit. That is a thing we also didn't used to allow. We also wouldn't have allowed Amazon to grow by, pricing things below cost when they couldn't buy a company. So like diapers.com wouldn't sell themselves to Amazon. So Amazon said, fine, we're going to discount diapers below cost. They lost $100 million in 6 months selling diapers below cost. Diapers.com went out of business, and they bought them for pennies on the dollar and shut them down. And every other investor and entrepreneur who thought about competing with Amazon got the message, right? Don't compete with Amazon. They'll spend $100 million to put you out of business. And so now anyone who gets an offer from Amazon sells to them, and nobody tries to make a business that directly competes with them. So you look at all of that, competition goes away. And that's true across the board. Every sector looks like this. 5 or fewer companies running, the beer industry and the bottle cap industry and cheerleading and professional wrestling and eyeglasses and international shipping and finance and cigarettes and aerospace. And they all look like this, right? Because we stopped enforcing antitrust across the board. So that leads to the second constraint, which is regulation, right? So all other things being equal, if you're in a boardroom and someone says, let's break the law, and someone else says, well, you expect to make X dollars by breaking the law, but we expect a fine of more than X dollars, and we expect that fine to arrive in real time, so it'll arrive before you and I have retired, so someone's going to be really angry at us about that fine. You don't do the thing, right? And if you do, then you get fined and no one else does the thing. Well, one of the things about regulatory capture is that it arises at a market concentration. If you think back to the Napster wars, right, when we used to have 100 tech companies fighting 7 entertainment companies. And the 7 entertainment companies, they were much smaller in aggregate than the 100 tech companies, less than 1/10 the size of those 100 companies. But the 7 companies only had 7 companies. They could agree on what they were going to tell Congress, judges, the European Commission, parliaments, regulators. They had one message. Tech was 100 companies. They were a rabble, not a cartel. They couldn't even agree on where to have a meeting or how to cater it, let alone what they were going to tell Congress. And they got their asses kicked. So today we live in a world that Tom Eastman calls 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And they've all figured out what their message is. And it's privacy law, consumer protection law, and labor law don't apply to us. If we violate them with an app, it's not a violation. Do algorithmic wage discrimination with Uber drivers where you change their wage from moment to moment based on your estimation that they're willing to drive for you. So the drivers who are pickiest get the highest wages, but as they grow less picky, the wage goes down, which is illegal, is not illegal supposedly if you do it with an app. Or the way Google or Facebook spy on you, clearly illegal, and yet they do it with an app, so it doesn't matter. Or the way that Amazon cheats you, right? Amazon has this $38 billion so-called advertising business. Not really advertising, it's pay for placement. So the things at the top of the search result page on Amazon are not the cheapest or the best. They're the ones that spent the most money on Amazon placement. So if you buy the first link on an Amazon search result, on average you pay 29% more than the best item. Buy anything from the first row and you pay a 25% premium. On average, you have to go 17 places down in a search result before you find a good deal on Amazon. Right? This is the paradox of Amazon, where they can say, "Oh, we offer prices at really good goods at really good prices." They do, but not where you can find them. They're in a third sub basement in a locked filing cabinet behind a sign that says "Beware the leopard." And so, they just say all these things that would be illegal if you did them in a brick and mortar store are illegal when we do them. So that's the regulatory capture part, which means that they can act worse, they can cheat us. But then in tech, there's always been this other force that constrained enshittification, which is self-help, because digital technologies are really flexible. We only know how to build one computer. It's the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine. Any program that is running on a computer you own that makes that computer work worse can be fixed with a program that makes it work better. If the computer in your printer won't accept third-party ink, you can write another program that will accept third-party ink. If your browser is sending your personal data to the websites you go to, there's an ad blocker that'll stop it. And for a long time, this provided an enormous check on the worst conduct of large firms, because they understood that, as frustrating as it might be to have customers who stubbornly refuse to organize their affairs to maximize your profits, it was far scarier to inspire those customers to sit down at a search engine and figure out how to avoid all the traps that you might lay in the future. So think of this equilibrium. We're all at a product meeting and someone says, "Hey, we could probably make an extra 2% on our ads by making them 20% more obnoxious." Someone else at that table, not someone who gives a damn about the user, will still pipe up and say, "Look, if 20% of our customers Google, how do I block ads?" Our revenue from those users is not the current baseline. It's not the 102% you think we're going to get to. It's zero forever. because no one's going to uninstall that ad blocker once they install it. So that's it. We kiss those users goodbye. Once the user installs the thing that lets them use third-party ink, we've lost them forever. Once the person goes to the third-party mechanic with their car, they're never coming back to the dealership. So there's always this equilibrium. And the other side of regulatory capture is not just under-regulating the large companies, it's over-regulating their potential competitors. So you can install an ad blocker on the web. More than 50% of all web users have installed that ad blocker. It's the largest consumer boycott in world history, as Doc Searles says. But that's because the web's an open platform. Apps, by contrast, are closed platforms, and they're protected by this range of policies. There's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that prohibits reverse engineering them because they're encrypted. There's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that can potentially criminalize terms of service violations. There's exotic theories of contract like tortious interference about allowing a user to escape some of the strictures that have been put on an app. There's trademark, copyright, patent, trade secrets, non-compete, non-disclosure. You add it all up and you have this thing that Jay Freeman calls felony contempt of business model. And because this kind of adversarial interoperability, this kind of reverse engineering, this kind of guerrilla compatibility that made the fortunes of all of our tech companies, right? Facebook didn't just say to those early users, hey, leave MySpace and come and admire our better privacy policy while you wait for your friends to wise up. They gave them a bot. And if you gave the bot your login and password for MySpace, it would go to MySpace several times a day, grab those messages, come back and stick them in your Facebook inbox, and you could reply to them and push them back out again. That was how Facebook did it. Do that to Facebook today. They will bomb you till the rubble bounces, right? And so this felony contempt of business model, as Jay Freeman says, has meant that these self-help measures no longer constrain the conduct of these firms. And so now when someone says, hey, what if we make our advertisements 2% more obnoxious and get a 20% return? Someone else says, YOLO, let's make them 100% more obnoxious and get a 10% increase in our return. Because anyone who types, how do I block ads in an app into a search engine gets a short answer, 2 words, you can't. Right? And so why not? Right? That you have a captive audience. So that leaves just the last constraint, and that's workers. So tech workers have historically had very low union density, and so you'd think that they had low worker power. It's not true. It's kind of the reason that they didn't have union density is because there was such a shortage of workers that they had worker power without unions. And so in general, they could just quit their job and go somewhere else, and their bosses knew it. And the way that their bosses motivated them was by appealing to a sense of mission, to a sense of duty, to a sense of duty to users. And so they said, don't be evil, connect the world. And they turned their workplaces into these kinds of whimsical campuses with daycares and gourmet cafeterias and massages and kombucha, and they'll even freeze your eggs for you so that you can work 20-hour days through your mother's funeral and your kid's Little League game and your only opportunity to bear children. And deliver, right? The librarian Fobazi Ettar, she calls this vocational awe, but, you know, Elon Musk calls it being extremely hardcore. And the paradox for bosses of motivating your workers by appealing to their sense of mission is that they feel a sense of mission. And so historically, if you said, hey, I like that Google Maps you built, but it'd be better with a lot of Burger King logos all over it because we just cut a deal with Burger King. Why don't you go off and do that now? The person who missed their mother's funeral, who missed their kid's Little League game, who missed their, doctor's appointment, and who missed their only opportunity to bear children is going to say, hell no. I have a sense of moral injury here. I refuse to do it. You can't make me. I can get a better job across the street, and no one else knows how. Well, 260,000 tech layoffs last year. Google fires 12,000 workers just months after doing a buyback that would have paid their salaries for 27 years. Tech workers know today that they don't have labor power on their side, right? The answer to, I'm not going to put the Burger King ads in the Google map is, all right, turn in your badge and don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And so that's what's changed. All the constraint has been taken away, and the same mediocrities who are no better than you and me, who are just as prone to rationalization as you or I am when their own well-being and fortunes are on the line, who can be just as pressured by investors as you or I could be when the investors are threatening to shut down their business or fire them. Those people no longer are a check against their own worst impulses and the worst impulses of the world around them. And yeah, the collapse of ZERP probably made their investors put more pressure on them, but the reason they caved to the pressure was the collapse of the constraints that have historically acted on these firms.
That is absolutely amazing. People are going to have to rewatch this interview several times because you have burned through so many giant concepts. So some of the things that I came up with, I mean, I got online in 1995, right? So I was near the beginning, not at the beginning, but close to it.
Sure.
And again, you were already a rock star even back then. I mean, that's,
micro famous.
Well, no, those were the heydays. And
sure.
One of the things that today's generation, I can't believe I just said that, but these kids today, they forget Yahoo, AltaVista, Lycos, Excite, and WebCrawler, right? Those were the big five. Or
don't forget to ask Jeeves.
Oh, I never used that one. I never. Yeah,
Poor
and then there was
Jeeves. He's crying in his silver salver.
Yeah, well, and then there was Dogpile, which I don't think ever counted. When I was researching this, they said that was one of the big ones. I'm like, no, that wasn't. But
yeah,
so with these, Yahoo is the one that stands out. I mean, Yahoo was like in the late '90s. They had their own magazine. They had their own. I think they had their own TV show for a while.
They had an ISP for a while in Japan. They had a lot.
They were too big to fail, right? There was no way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, they were doing commercials all over TV, and then, we also had all these spinoffs at that time, like MSNBC and all sorts of stuff like that. So there was a lot going on, and Yahoo is completely forgotten today, right? In fact, I'm surprised that people still use Yahoo Mail. That's 20-year lock-in. It's like they forgot to switch to Gmail, I guess. So is this some kind of a cyclical thing? Because again, at that time, I don't think anyone could have envisioned Yahoo disappearing, and yet that empire just collapsed and fragmented. And then those other search engines like AltaVista or Lycos, nobody even remembers those names anymore.
So I think that dynamism, like Yahoo is maybe like the last gasp of that dynamism. There was a lot of dynamism in the early tech years. So my dad was a computer scientist. So we had DEC mainframes that we had terminals for in the house where we could dial up to them at the university in the 70s. And I remember going down, or not mainframes, but mini computers. I remember going down to the data center and seeing these mini computers that were incredibly expensive and super cutting edge. And, they just ended up getting folded into Compaq and then just going extinct, right? And that was pretty normal. Computers used to come and go all the time. Atari, Commodore. There were just lots and lots of different systems. And I compare it sometimes to the controlled burns that we had in California in the pre-settler colonial era, where, the indigenous people who lived here used to set fires in controlled ways every year to reduce the amount of fuel on the forest floor and open the canopy for new growth. And when the settlers arrived, they thought that this was too dangerous, and they ordered a halt to it. And now, a couple hundred years later, we have a lot of fire debt. And, California is very famously on fire a lot of the time. And it's not just the climate emergency. It's that we have built up so much fuel on the floor that it just takes one spark. Now, we get more sparks because of the climate emergency, but it just takes one spark and the fire burns and burns and burns. And we used to have good fire, right? We used to allow companies that had run their course, that had run out of ideas, that had become top heavy, that had what Clayton Christensen calls the innovator's dilemma, or the Justice Brandeis called the curse of bigness, where doing anything really great requires goring the ox of someone important in the company or some important customer you have, or both. And so you just only make incremental improvements, not really big innovative ones. There's no what Schumpeter calls creative destruction, right? The company ossifies and then it keels over. I was a Silicon Graphics integrator. I watched Sun eat our lunch. This is the normal life cycle of computing. And with the drawdown of antitrust, where we started to allow companies that no longer could make things themselves buy the companies that could, or drive them out of business with predatory pricing, we lost the good fire, right? So Yahoo was able to sustain itself for much longer than any company should have been able to. It was really the architect of the mass acquisition strategy. Before Google was buying lots of companies, Yahoo bought and really destroyed every great, cool Web 2.0 company there was. Flickr is a good example. There's so many of them, Tumblr and broadcast.com and so on. They made a lot of people's fortunes, right? Stuart Butterfield sold Flickr and then went off and created Slack, or Mark Cuban became a billionaire selling broadcast.com, and I don't know what the Tumblr guy is doing. I hope he's having a nice time. But these acquisitions, they weren't good for the actual products. Those products are all either dead or on life support, or being nursed along as hobbies by people who just love them. But they were viable businesses, and they became creaking antiques because of Yahoo. And Yahoo eventually was disciplined by the market. Like eventually, I guess they had a fire sale. So they sold their assets to Verizon, and then, or maybe I'm missing a stage. Did they sell them to Warner's first? Or no, was it AOL? Anyway, there was this string of kind of pass-alongs where it just got written down and written down and written down. These assets became more and more distressed. And then they landed where they are now, where everyone's taking these giant write-offs and there's nothing left. The amazing thing about the big five tech companies is that they have been able to sustain themselves long after a fair market would have disciplined them by putting them out of business, because they are making their products worse and better products exist but can't get any market oxygen. And there's this great quote from Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg, I love him because he's the kind of idiot who says like criminally actionable things that would otherwise be hard to prove because you need to know intent. He says them aloud and then puts them in writing. So there's this quote from Mark Zuckerberg in a group chat on Facebook that came out in one of the antitrust investigations, where he's saying to someone else, you're right. Google Plus is not our big social media competitor. It's Instagram. And the great thing about startups versus companies started by real mature businesses is that you can just buy them out and then they stop being a threat. This is an actually illegal thing to say. Like, it's quite amazing for him to say. This is like having a folder on your desktop called like mens rea, filled with documents called like premeditated murder _1.docx. But, Zuck loves to put it in writing, and, God bless him. That strategy has been much more viable than it has any right to be, because no one is stepping in. Well, no one had been stepping in until now, until the current Federal Trade Commission, the current DOJ, which are respectively suing Amazon and Google. No one had stepped in to say enough is enough. We're going to start enforcing the law. And now finally we have reached the terminal point of Stein's law. Stein's law says that anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. And we are finally seeing real muscular enforcement. And again, as much as I'd like to say it was the people who are running these agencies, who I think are extraordinary, Lena Khan at the FTC and Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ, I think the real story here is that globally there is a lack of patience for monopolies and their abuses, and that this has created a new political will for the enforcers who would have tried to do this job no matter what, but who finally have a tailwind, which is why we're seeing this emerge not just in America, but in Australia and Europe and the United Kingdom and Canada and Japan, South Korea, and now China as well, right? The Chinese state is cracking down on its big tech just as much as the American state is. Remember that the next time, a Facebook spokesman like Nick Clegg says, oh, how will we defend the West's cyberspace against the Chinese Communist Party unless we have monopolies like Facebook as our champions? China does not act like its tech monopolies are their champions. They act like they're their enemies, and they are like literally rounding up their CEOs and putting them in gulags, which is not a thing I advocate even for Mark Zuckerberg, but it should go a long way to telling us where the Chinese state thinks of the role of Chinese tech companies in their own national picture.
Well, again, just an absolute tour de force on all of this. So I did have one thing that I absolutely wanted to touch on before we close off, and that was the platform ecosystem wars. This one kind of caught me by surprise. Again, we've got our big five tech companies, right? Apple, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Amazon, which have kind of solidified or ossified into this big five, each of these groups came up with success in a specific niche product. They've diversified into full ecosystems. And the part that kind of caught me was some of this I had seen coming, right? Like Google getting into hardware. I'd kind of seen that after they got into smartphones. Microsoft getting into hardware. That makes sense because Apple made a big comeback and they are so hardware centric. So that I saw coming. The part that surprised me though was like all of these groups at the same time, they got into home automation and theater. They all came out with smart speakers, smart security systems, alarm clocks that would talk to you, and it was all at once, I mean, they're all also into social media. Obviously, they've all got movies and music. So
yeah,
the internet was originally built around these vertical specializations. So I'm wondering if there's any advantage to these ecosystems other than just retaining customers through their entire technology experience.
Well, I can make the business case for it. I think that it's plausible, but it collides with reality. So the business case for this has to do with spillover innovation. So if you're Google and you expend some capital on R&D on, say, image recognition in using convoluted neural networks, right? And you now get an insight, a technology that you can use to improve like maps and photos and search and YouTube. And if you had a dating service, you could put it there. So the expected return on the investment for the R&D is much higher. The problem with this is the innovator's dilemma that like, if any of those things is going to revolutionarily change any of those products that you have existing customers for, that you have executives who will defend and so on, it's very unlikely you're gonna use it. But I think that's the business case for it. But I'll also say that companies that made their nut being very innovative and then stopped innovating because of scale and because lightning rarely strikes twice and because of whatever, get very insecure. And they start to look over their shoulder at one another. And they start to chase trends. So we used to say in the early 2000s that if you wanted to get Google to do something really stupid, get Yahoo to do it first. And when Yahoo went into China and agreed to censor its search results and turn over its user data to the Chinese government so they could figure out who to round up and torture, Google went in because they thought they couldn't afford to yield China to Yahoo, and then they got hacked by the Chinese government. And Sergey Brin, who is a Soviet refugee who has a visceral horror of that kind of state interference, just unilaterally pulled them out in a way that was like not related to their business needs, but just Sergey's personal idiosyncratic views. And even back then, Google, I think that Google had a different reason for chasing Yahoo. I think that the Google management thought of themselves as college kids dressed up as businessmen, and that they didn't know what serious businessmen did, and that Yahoo was run by real business people. And so if Yahoo was doing it, it was a smart business thing to do. And like, now that they were running this company that was extremely valuable, they needed to be businessmen. Today, I think it's just that all of these people are like, I am running this company that everyone thinks is the innovation factory, and we're just plumbers. We just like buy other people's companies, strip out anything really disruptive, take the tiny little incremental improvements that would be like point releases in a regular software cycle, and use them to just add a little bit of polish to our existing offerings, or to integrate around the edges of our offerings. And then we operationalize it in this giant bureaucracy that's about, load balancing across data centers in, 100 countries, and not about, moving fast and breaking things, or, running our servers under desks at Stanford in cases that we built out of Lego, or any of those other kind of heroic things that we hear so much about from the early days, and that they still trade on, right, as companies, that they have all the external trappings of. That's the ball pit is supposed to be, the stand-in for the, burning passion that has you working around the clock to finish your search algorithm, because you have had an insight that is going to change the world. And you don't have that anymore. You don't have that youthful vigor, but you got a ball pit. And you can get in the ball pit and pretend to be a boy genius, Val Kilmer in Real Genius, right? But you're fundamentally a guy who had a good idea 15, 20 years ago. And I think in that world, it's really easy to get stampeded into chasing trends, especially when big institutional shareholders control a lot of your stock. Even if they don't control the voting shares, because all these companies have dual share structures, they control a lot of your net worth. Because if you're Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin or early Apple employees, you got a ton of your portfolio tied up in your own company's stock. And if the institutionals bolt for the exits, your stock price tanks, and you're billions of dollars poorer. And so when your institutionals show up and say, what's your metaverse strategy? You've got to have a metaverse strategy, even if you privately think metaverse is really dumb, or cryptocurrency or AI or, whatever. And so I think that they're just getting stampeded into it. Home speakers were like a version of this. And now we have, AI and smart, gadgets.
Cory, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank
Truly
you very
a
much.
pleasure and absolutely an honor. Again, you have been a hero of mine forever. So thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Let me close by asking what's coming up for you in the first part of 2024, and what do you see happening for this swirling morass that we call the tech industry and the modern internet?
Well, what's coming up for me is books. So I write when I'm anxious. So I came out of lockdown with 9 new books. And I just contracted to write a 10th, God help me. So as we record this at the early part of February, we're less than 2 weeks out from the publication of this book, The Bezel, which is the sequel to Red Team Blues, which has just come out in paperback. You can read them in either order. They're not sequential. In fact, they go back in time. And they're these books about a hard-charging, two-fisted forensic accountant who's been in Silicon Valley for 40 years unraveling high-tech finance scams. So real fun books to write. They're just romps. Basically Panama Papers fanfic. And in terms of what I see as the future of tech, I mean, I think we're at an inflection point in terms of antitrust, and what remains to be seen. The big questions are whether antitrust. Do we end up with antitrust fizzing out, right? Because the forces of reaction take over. Jim Jordan just tabled a new budget where he just basically knocks the DOJ's antitrust division budget back down to like Clinton era levels and leaves them with, that we already have fewer antitrust enforcers policing the entire American economy than the Smithsonian has security guards. Right. So we are already we have already defunded the corporate police, and Jim Jordan wants to effectively zero out their budget. So that's one question. The other question is, are they going to figure out good tactics or bad, right? Assuming they remain intact, are they going to pursue the tactics that we saw for many years where, you had regulators that tried to make the companies better instead of making them easier to leave? And oftentimes those are antithetical goals, right? Like if you say, all right, you've got to exert a lot of control over your users to limit harassment and hate speech and scams and all kinds of other things, all of which I'm in favor of limiting on social media, don't get me wrong. You also set up a dynamic in which these companies can credibly say, well, we can't allow third parties to interoperate with us. We can't allow users to leave and take their data with them. We can't allow users who've left to send messages to the users who are still here, because then we will fail at our duty to observe and police those users, and we'll get in trouble. And you know, it's worth asking why people stay on platforms where they're treated badly. Right? Rather than asking why they're treated badly on platforms, ask why they don't leave. And the reason they don't leave is that the people that matter to them are there. And if you leave, you can't talk to those people anymore. And if, like, you had a Verizon subscription and every time you answer the phone, you got an electric shock, you would change to T-Mobile. But if the shock was small enough, and after you changed to T-Mobile, you wouldn't be able to speak to anyone who'd ever made a call to you on your Verizon phone, you might put up with the shocks, right? The answer to this might be making Verizon treat you better. I'm in favor of that. But we also can solve this problem pretty comprehensively just by making it easier to quit Verizon. And, you know, that's what we need to do for these companies. We need to create portability so that you can take your relationships, your data, and the value that keeps you on a platform with you when you go somewhere else, so that the bad choices that the everyday people, no better, no worse than you and me, make don't weigh as heavily on you and your outcomes.
Cory, thank you again so much for your
Thanks,
time
Tim.
today, sir.
I appreciate that. Thank you.